I'd like to first thank NIFC for organizing this excellent conference. So I've definitely learned a lot from listening to all the excellent presentations in the last 2 days. So today I'll just share a little bit about, I come from ALS. So very briefly, I just going to talk about 2 contaminants, microplastics and PFAS, and also from a contract lab experience. The picture here shows, a whole series of emerging contaminants, whether you want to call it emerging contaminants or contaminants of emerging concern, or when the instrument companies comes up with sexier techniques, then we discover new contaminants, okay, whichever way you put it. So I'm part of ALS, so this is just a very brief global map of, I'm part of the life science division. We have other divisions, but I'm only showing the life science area, sector. We have about 240 labs globally, and I'm based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. So we've got about 18,000 people worldwide, but about two-thirds of us are in the life science division. So actually, when it comes to addressing the issue of emerging contaminants from a contract lab experience, if you look at Southeast Asia, okay, one of the major economic activities is agriculture. And then if you look at, most in Southeast Asian countries, the issues with contaminated groundwater resource, reliance on groundwater for agricultural activities, also our sewage and wastewater treatment infrastructure. And then you look at the items as being exported, major agri-food exporter in Southeast Asia. The crops, rice, coffee, fruit, vegetables, fish, seafood, whether it's raw or processed, is not unexpected to be able to detect all these wide range of contaminants in the food that we export or process. Just a quick comment though, the interesting part about this is if you look at the majority of research work and publications on emerging contaminants or even the awareness of it, a lot of it arises from US, Canada, Europe, Japan, and more recently, a lot coming out from China. But if you want to compare that, you won't see as much. There's a huge imbalance in terms of emerging contaminants research and awareness in Southeast Asia versus developed economies. And hence there is some impact. So this is just a quick snapshot, and this is taken from Shane Snyder's paper recently published in June, where he studied the emerging contaminants research in Southeast Asia. And it's interesting and good to see that Vietnam is actually very far ahead in terms of the published work on emerging contaminants. Okay, so this sort of gives you an idea where they break it down into the categories of where the research is, pharmaceuticals, PCPs, or pesticide compounds, or industrial compounds. But, when you look at the type of contaminants out there, there's at least about anywhere between 50,000 to 100,000 types of compounds that's in daily use. So it's a far cry than, the capabilities of the laboratories to be able to catch up with all these emerging issues. So whether it's the pollution pathway is coming from, industrial effluents from manufacturers, whether it's coming from poor infrastructure of the wastewater treatment plants, untreated groundwater resource, leachates running off landfills because they were not lined, and hence it's permeating into our surface water and groundwater. Eventually, it finds its way into our water and food chain. So it's not surprising that, with the existing infrastructures in some developing economies in Southeast Asia, that we will find a very, very wide range of contaminants in the processed or unprocessed food. So earlier in a slide, I talked about, I highlighted there's very wide range of contaminants. And we've listened to really great presentations in the last 2 days or last day and a half on the different wide range of techniques, whether it's straight up ICP-MS or a GC-MS-MS or speciated techniques, LC-GC-FID or GC-GC-TOF. One of the challenges in many Southeast Asian countries is actually that it requires extensive financial and human resource investments. And I think if you go to a lot of undergraduate institutions or universities, your typical graduate would not be exposed to, say, LC-MS-MS. They will not have even hands-on experience. But yet when they graduate, they're expected to operate this instrument for whether they're working for a government organization or for a contract lab. Hence, for a contract laboratory, serving the food manufacturers or food importers or exporters, there's a lot of challenge to bring up a person who's not even seen that instrument and to try and deliver that data reliably and consistently day in, day out for a very wide range of food matrices. Okay, so this is some of the challenges, but I will call them constructive challenges because when you do solve the problem, you become better today than yesterday. So that's one of the challenges, and then the other one is also sample preparation, pre-treatment, very wide range of food matrices. Hence, it's not as easy as just filtering a water sample. Depending on a type of matrix, like the one mentioned, discussed earlier on Mosh Mower or 3-MCPD in oils and fats, significant amount of experience required in sample pre-treatment. And the chances of getting a false positive or false negative is highly likely if the pre-treatment is not done correctly, as most laboratory analysts would know. And the other challenge is when you're talking about emerging contaminants is you're no longer detecting at a ppm level. You're talking parts per billion or even in some contaminants parts per trillion. And yesterday we had a good talk addressing lab contamination. So part of the challenge in actually when you're looking at sub-PPT level contamination testing is making sure you're not detecting a false positive, which is coming from yourself or your processes. Another one is availability of reference standards. Anyone coming from a lab would know that most of the instrument, actually all of the instrument companies, the pre-treatment cartridges, whether it's an SPE or catchers, internal reference standards, no matter how exotic or unexotic they are, all originate from either US or Europe or Japan. So think about the challenges, and I'm sure anyone operating in a Southeast Asian laboratory here will attest that during the pandemic, you couldn't get solvents. It was very challenging to get solvents, to buy internal reference standards, and especially when it's an emerging contaminant. They just published a paper last month, and then you're scrambling to find not just the method, but the internal reference standards and availability. And even though now in Malaysia, at least, even we're in the endemic stage now, and transportation has sort of come back to normal, on average, it can take 2 to 3 months just to get an internal reference standard. So many times in ALS, we have our counterparts in Europe and US, and they would take them, say, 2 to 3 weeks to set up a new method. And it can take us significantly longer because just availability to easy access to whether it's a very specialized reagent, reference standard, or even a certain module to be added to your instrument. So these are some of the interesting challenges that one face in a laboratory trying to keep up with all these emerging contaminants testing. Okay. So earlier I used the term constructive challenges because when you do solve it, good on you. You're better today than yesterday. Very often, a food manufacturer, say in Malaysia, will be exporting to Europe, and it's not surprising for us to get a midnight call on a Friday night and said, my product has been held up at a port. This is a problem. Quick, can you test it? I'll send the samples to you tomorrow. But, sometimes this method is not even set up. Or we knew about this, there's been a recall, but the time it takes for us to get those reference standards into the laboratory, validate, set up the method, get your LOD, your LOQs, takes time. But many food manufacturers do not understand it. They say, why would it take that long? I'll get you the sample. Get it done, 2 days. You can't. And there's not even time to sometimes get it accredited. And on many occasions, even the ISO 17025 auditors are not familiar with the methods. Okay, so that takes them even more time to get familiarized with the method before they can even accredit the laboratory. So these are some of the challenges. And then when it comes time to, when there's a recall alert, like I said, you know, when you're serving a lot of food manufacturers, that call can come in any time with very little notice period. So for a laboratory, you know, a lot of times your testing is driven by regulations, whether it's a local regulation or an international regulation. The need to develop that test is based on regulations. And the regulations dictates the parameters that you should test. And within that parameter, it lists down the limit of detection or the regulatory limits. And hence, from there, you decide which method to use, and hence you decide which instrument to use or which instruments to buy. But imagine if that recall is sudden, you don't have time to react. Even if you do have an instrument in the lab, but just to get the reference standard and the right ion exchange column or the right catches column, you need time to bring that item in. And these are some of the challenges faced, especially in Southeast Asia, where you have to keep abreast with the very fast-paced regulations that's shifting in US and Europe. And another a common one that we have faced is sometimes, while even if locally they have, implement a certain regulation, the awareness on enforcement is another story. So you can look at the Food Act and say, oh, there's a very long list of regulations, great, they're keeping up. But the enforcement of those regulations is another matter, because in most countries, the enforcement has to be kept at par with the government laboratory. So government labs has to first get it accredited before the enforcement officers can act on those regulations. So if they don't act on it, if they're not accredited, they cannot act on it because they cannot benchmark or cross-check your numbers. Okay, sometimes, so on many times we are ahead of the government lab, but you know, they can't enforce it. Okay, so I want to shift gears very quickly now. So because there's two things I want to talk about. One of them is being microplastics. So here's another global map that shows the share of globally mismanaged plastic waste, and this is where, so basically just a quick color chart is the darker the color, the more serious the mismanaged plastics. And you can see where Southeast Asia, every color is either dark red or dark orange, okay? So the lighter the color, the better they manage their plastic waste. And then if you look at the literature on the amount of research articles or techniques developed, that's all in the yellow zone. Okay, the European countries, North America has been most proactive in developing techniques moving into microplastics detection. So there's a lot of catching up to do, but just a few points about microplastics. For the uninitiated, I just have a very simple pictorial diagram on plastics and sizes defined. So if a big piece of plastic like this, we call it a mega. Okay, so that's a hippo there, just keep you in a size perspective. Tear it down a little bit, becomes a small plastic bag. It's the size of a cat is macro. And then size of an ant or mosquito, mesoplastic. And then take it down to a size that everyone's talking about, 5 millimeters and below, size of a tick, microplastic. And take it down one step further, is a picture that everybody can relate to, the COVID virus, that's nanoplastics. So we have, in Malaysia, we've been investigating microplastics for the last 2 to 3 years, not so much driven by any international export market, but more on creating baseline data in our water and air. especially river water and drinking water. And to this day, we have yet to encounter any one sample that does not contain microplastics. So many types of plastics and very wide range of toxicity. And one of the challenges with microplastics or nanoplastics is detection, is isolation of the plastic material from the matrix. Okay, because unlike many chemistries that we tend to be accustomed to, you're able to extract what you want either into an aqueous buffer or a solvent. And you investigate, you detect that analyte of interest dissolved in that particular media. But plastic is the plastic material is a physical solid particle. And it's very difficult to reproduce a sample from one sample to another when it comes to microplastics detection. So it requires a very complete overhaul of my chemist's thinking in the laboratory, because they're used to extracting, spike it, matrix spike it, and analyze it. But it doesn't work that way for plastics. Okay, so a lot of challenges in cleanup. Even a simple wastewater sample or even groundwater, huge challenges in cleanup. So I did talk about, so when we investigate microplastics in all these different samples, there are many different types. So it can break down into fibers, fragments, microbeads, pellets, films, foams. And then you have further breakdown into that, you have the primary plastics and the secondary plastics, microplastics. So primary is a microplastics that's created that way for its original intended use. So those, if anybody is still using facial washes with those microbeads, it's very effective to, as a facial wash, well, that's a primary microplastic, because it was manufactured that way for its intended use. But when the microbead finds its way through our wastewater stream, UV degradation, bacteria degradation, and degrades, that becomes a secondary microplastic. Okay? So for us in the laboratory, we don't differentiate between the two. At this stage, the research is still at the stage of, let's discover how many particles of microplastics do we have in this 1 liter of water. So of course, when it comes to, and these are some of the common microplastics that we have found in different types of wide range of samples. I show a picture of face masks there as well, because this is about 40% polypropylene. Just a side information only, in the laboratory we did a very simple experiment where we just took one of these face masks and soaked only the interior part that faces you, because we were told to wear this for 2 years. We soak it for 2 minutes in water, and then we filtered that 100 mils of water, and we happily able to count 400 microplastic particles, consisting mostly of polypropylene, rayon, and polyethylene. Yeah. Well, that's just a side information. I'm not trying to discourage everybody from not wearing their face mask. And of course, do not forget that within the plastic particles, you have a very wide range of absorbed chemicals and additive chemicals. So we're not even at that stage yet where we're going to say, well, we discovered these microplastic particles, let's now do a further extraction and identify the additives by either GC-MS-MS or LC-MS-MS. It's going to be these two techniques generally, and also ICP-MS that's looking at all the chemicals. It's really not at that stage. We're still at the stage of, let's come up with some reliable methods, consistent methods to analyze how much microplastics do we have in our water and food. So just a side note, the question is, are we drinking enough microplastics? Absolutely. It was through this, my own research here, that we discovered that the fancier the tea bag, unfortunately, the higher the amount of microplastics, because the fancy tea bags where it's triangular, okay, that's material is made out of nylon. So when you soak it, actually, they have done the study, you get about 1 billion pieces of microplastics and nanoplastics in a healthy cup of tea. So in addition to getting the alkaloids and the caffeine, what's wrong with 1 billion particles of nanoplastics? Yeah. And then there's been a lot of studies on microplastics in bottled water. On average, it's about 325 particles, per liter of water on average. So yeah, it's and we have done our own studies as well. So like I said, we have yet to uncover any bottled water that didn't contain it, at least in Malaysia. Yeah. Yeah, beverages. It's not surprising because it's in a water. It's in a water body. It's in the rivers, in the groundwater. So, and it's not something that, and at nanoplastic level, it's very hard to filter. So you will find it also in all sorts of beverages and drinks, and as well as a favorite drink for a lot of us here, beer. Yeah. So at least you know that when you have your alcohol, you feel good. Plus, you get a dose of nanoplastics. Are we eating enough microplastics? Oh yeah, absolutely. Because yeah, what's one of the biggest issue with plastics pollution is in the ocean, and how do we make sea salt? So that's why most of the sea salt contains microplastics. Okay, about 90% of sea salt contains microplastics. And interesting, after all these studies came out, the company that sells the Himalaya rock salt, they use this as a marketing material. They say, see, that's why you should be taking rock salt and not sea salt. So that's people capitalizing on some information for marketing fodder. Yeah. So that's and seafood. Yeah. So that's the global map on the right there shows the microplastic consumption, because a lot of these countries are huge seafood, huge intake of seafood. And these days, when it's processed or in a can or served in a restaurant, they may not be local anyway, so they are coming from all over the world. So it's going to be very hard to trace down. And we have done some studies as well on different types of biota in Malaysia and on seafood. Yeah, it's quite interesting numbers. Yeah, but it hasn't stopped me from eating seafood. Yeah. So yeah, just to break it down. Quick summary of what I've mentioned. Basically there's all these different types of plastic materials, whether it's micro or nano, different types of shapes and sizes, primary and secondary, and under that different types of polymer types. And if you want to break it down further, the composition will be organic, synthetic, polymeric, inorganic, or even natural. Natural is, we're talking about natural rubber. There's a lot of interest now in looking at tire road wear particles, because earlier perception was, oh, the plastics is coming from improper disposal, because there was no proper recycling facilities. People were throwing plastics everywhere, and that's why it's polluting our waterways. But your tires, your road wear particles, there's a lot of synthetic polymers in there, and that's the tire road dust that's washing into the waterways. Okay, so still a lot of work to be done in this area. Typical methods as used. So far what we've used in Malaysia, microscopy, simple and fast and easy to set up, non-destructive, but you need a really patient person to want to sit there and count, okay? Count particles for you. Doesn't tell you much about what type of microplastics you have. It doesn't have much chemical information, and definitely doesn't tell you much about the polymer composition data. The other technique we've used is micro FTIR. This one is because each type of polymer has its own fingerprint region, and so non-destructive, and practically you can go down to about 20 microns in a microplastic size that you can uncover. But this one doesn't quantify. It tells you what kind of polymer you have, but it cannot tell you how much. Okay. So the third technique that we use, to tell us how much is we use pyrolyzer GCMS. Sensitive method, but it's destructive. Because many times with microplastic testing is because it's a physical polymer bead. It's not dissolved. So every sample can be different, because it's very hard to reproduce your microplastic data from one bottle to another, and that's a challenge. So in the microplastic community, people are still talking about consistency of procedures and methods for cleanup. to make your data consistent, okay? So from there, you get the different parallelograms on a paralyzer, from a paralyzer GCMS, and this technique allows you to quantify. So there is no best technique. All these techniques are complementary to each other. Just one side note, because I recognize there's a lot of people from laboratories here. So there hasn't been much of a recent number, but this is a number from a 2014 studies that in life science research labs alone, we're not talking about contract laboratories or in the last 2 years, all the pathology labs. And this study is about 9 years old, 8 years old. Just life science research labs alone, they estimated there's about 6 million tons of plastic waste. So we all come from a laboratory. So while we are pushing the boundaries on emerging contaminants, we are also part of the solution as well as the problem. Yeah. So just a side note for all the people in the laboratory here, we have to think about how can we curb the addiction to plastic in our own laboratories. Whether, from a corporate responsibility perspective, track the plastics consumption for the year. Do we want to look at using bioplastics, eco-friendly plastic materials, reusable labware, not something that a lot of people involved in emerging contaminants like to hear, because we like one-off use to minimize contamination. As I've said, one of the issues with trace contaminants analysis is minimizing lab contamination, whether it's a carryover from the previous run or coming from laboratory analysts. We want to reduce that. So reusable labware is not usually, we're usually not in favor of that. Okay, I'll rush through this one very fast. Yeah. Okay, PFAS. I noticed there's a lot of posters outside on PFAS, so I won't go into the details of the types of PFAS. And I think this, a lot of people are aware of those chemistry behind PFAS, except that there's about 5,000, at least 5,000 PFAS compounds, and depending on which literature you're reading and when, every year when you pick up the next journal, it adds another few hundred. Okay, when it first started, it said 4,000, 4,500, 5,000, it just keeps going up. But for us, when it comes to analysis, there are very few chemical reference standards available. So the internal reference standards for PFAS, I think right now is running about maybe 55 to 60. It's quite limited versus the potential amount of PFAS compounds out there. So once again, I talked about, a lab develops method based on regulations. So PFAS in water, highly regulated in the US, Europe, Australia, but not so much in Southeast Asia. So for a lab operating here, you develop your methods based on regulations, and the regulation isn't there. So that's some of the challenges in, here's a quick one. So in Malaysia, we've set up for water, looking into food, and next to the picture here is our SciEx instrument that we use for LC-MS. Anyone who runs multiple labs across the region will understand the issues, challenges of method optimization, equipment standardization for method transfer perspective. So within ALS Southeast Asia, we standardize on a SciEx for our trace contaminants analysis by LC-MS, particularly in food matrices, because we've found them to be very robust instruments. So I said there's a lot of PFAS compounds. So recently we're seeing more of people looking into.
We're way over time.
Okay, sorry.
So
right.
I apologize for that.
Yeah.
But this was a very interesting presentation that spanned quite a lot of different topics in terms of challenges of emerging contaminants, and then two areas that she's particularly interested in terms of at least one, externalities associated with laboratory methods and how it might cause pollution side effects, and then her concerns with PFAS. Do we have any, if we don't have any quick, well, I should say the suggestion was that why don't those people with questions talk to her outside privately so that they have time for the break before we go back? But we want to thank you very much for a very interesting presentation.
Yeah, I'll just put my email up here. If they have questions, they can email me as well.
You could talk to her also in the hall. Okay.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.